So without, whoops, I turned my mic off, sorry, I hit the wrong button. So without breaking any HIPAA rules, who here might be willing to confess that you are wearing some sort of corrective lens to help you see? Is that, so contacts, glasses, anything along those lines? Okay, so how many in the room would then say, not just I'm wearing corrective lenses, but like I have really bad eyesight. Like my eyes are terrible. Who would confess? All right. This is not a sin confession. Okay, this is just an imperfection, right? This is part of it. So we would say not just I'm wearing something to correct my eyes, but I have really, really bad eyes, right? Now, how many in the room would make those who have already raised their hand hate you by saying, right, maybe not hate, that's a strong word, but would say, how many would say that you have really great eyes? Anybody in the room that we have really great eyes? I'm in that category. I'm thankful for that. I've never had eye problems, but I will say, as I get older, my eyes focus a little bit more slowly, right? They're a little bit slower to catch things. So here's the thing. When it comes to vision, right? When it comes to our eyes, something that always affects our sight is distance. Now, I'm not talking about can we see closer, can we see farther away? I'm not talking about nearsighted and farsightedness, but I'm just talking about distance. So just for example, if I were here, but I was 50 feet back, right? I would be a little bit smaller to you, right? It's just a fact. If we were to go outside here to the football field in the back, and I were to stand on one side of the football field and amplify my voice, and you were on the other side of the football field, you could hear me, but you would only see just a little bit, right? So when you go to a concert, right, or something along those lines, now because, to get affordable seats, you have to be way in the back or way up top. And so what do they have? They have the, like, Jumbotron, so you could see something because distance affects our sight. And here's what I want us to connect here is that distance is to vision as time is to a promise. So as time passes, promises are harder to see. They're harder to wait on. In other words, when we receive a promise, like we like to, if you're like me, we like to have it fulfilled right away. Otherwise, we begin to doubt the promise, right? Now, sometimes we use this to our advantage. I remember when my girls were little, it was, I would bribe them like, okay, if you'll do this, right, then maybe we'll go have ice cream tonight. If you'll behave yourselves at these people's houses, we'll stop on the way home and get ice cream. And really what I was hoping is either because I really wanted ice cream or, right, or I was hoping maybe that they would forget. They would just do what I wanted them to do, and then I wouldn't actually have to fulfill the promise, right? So maybe if you'll go to bed early, then I'll come and read a book to you, and then I'm passing through the book, right? But here's the thing is if we fail to fulfill our promises, then our kids begin to doubt the promise and the promiser, right? They begin to doubt not just the promise, not just what I say, but then they begin to doubt me. Is Dad actually going to deliver, or is he just trying to trick us again? Right? So we're in this series, this big series, To the Ends of the Earth, walking through the book of Acts. And we said last week, we talked a little bit about vision and sight and how sometimes we fail to see the things that are just right in front of us, even though it's obvious. And Stephen here is giving this speech in Acts chapter number 7 as we're walking through, and we've already seen as he's defending himself and kind of proclaiming things. And it's not a traditional defense in the sense that they've brought some accusations and he's specifically going down accusation by accusation. Rather, what Stephen is trying to do is to open their eyes to the promises, the fulfillment of the promise that they've been waiting on for centuries. So he's already done this by talking about Abraham going back and the creation of God's covenant people. We looked last week at Joseph, how God has preserved his covenant people. Today we shift and begin to look at the life of Moses and how Stephen talks and uses the life of Moses. Now, this was a specific accusation against him. You remember earlier in chapter 6 when they said that, hey, he's teaching, this man, Stephen's teaching that Jesus is going to upset the customs of Moses. So they're kind of enacting Moses. And so Stephen begins to tell the story of Moses, but not just in defense, but so they might see, perhaps, right, that Jesus came to fulfill God's ultimate promises. And so if you're writing notes, if you've got a journaling Bible, and as we've provided, and you like to take notes, and then I invite you to write down our big idea of the day is that in our faith journey, waiting is inevitable, right? In our faith journey, waiting is inevitable. Let's talk through the text, Acts chapter 7. We'll start in verse number 17. And as we talk through, what I'm going to do is I'm going to kind of narrate a little bit, and then we'll pull a couple points of application here at the end. But as the time of promise drew near, which God had granted Abraham, the people increased and multiplied in Egypt. Let me just pause right there. You're like, you didn't get very far, Pastor. No, I'm sorry. But at the time of promise, let's make sure that we understand the context. And so there's a little bit of context in the first couple verses here that we're going to look at today. And at the time of promise, if you remember back in earlier part of the defense here, back in verse number 6, this is the time of promise that God had given to Abraham. It's Stephen referenced in verse number 6. This was the 400 years. Right? You remember Stephen retelling Abraham's story when Abraham said, hey, I'm going to make you a great people, and I'm going to multiply your descendants. You're going to be like the stars in the sky, and many nations are going to come from you. And he says, but he brought Abraham to this promised land. He said, this is going to be the land, but I'm not going to give it to you or your descendants. Instead, I'm going to send you into exile for 400 years. And you're going to be enslaved and oppressed for 400 years, and then I'm going to bring them back, right? And then I'm going to bring them into the land of promise. So at the time of promise, when the time of promise drew near, this is the season in which we enter, in which Moses begins to show up. So at the time of promise, when it drew near, when God had granted to Abraham, the people had increased and multiplied. So the Israelites, They're as a nation, they had grown. Now, they were enslaved in Egypt, which we'll see, right? But they had grown, and estimates say somewhere between 500,000 and 600,000 people. Their nation had grown until, verse 18, until there arose over Egypt another king who did not know Joseph. Now, we looked a little bit at Joseph's story. Remember, Joseph was a great, faithful Jew, and he was faithful to God, and God gave him favor and used Joseph's life to preserve his covenant people. So Joseph was very well respected by the Egyptians, but now, generations later, there is a king, a Pharaoh, who's over Egypt, who doesn't know who Joseph is. And all he sees is this 500,000 plus people that are growing in number. Verse 19, he being the king, the Pharaoh, that didn't know Joseph, he dealt shrewdly with our race and forced our fathers to expose their infants so that they would not be kept alive. So growing, multiplying people, this nation is rising under Egypt, and so what do? He's like population control, and this is his decision shrewdly, is infanticide, killing babies, right? He's going to take all of the male children and put them to death, to expose them, to let them die. That's how he's going to control the population. Why does he do that? He's scared, right? We look at it and we know that this is the action of a king, of a Pharaoh who's scared, who's intimidated. He's worried about the multiplication, the growing Hebrew population. And so this is his shrewd plan that he's enacted to limit their population by infanticide. So that's our context. Verse 20, at this time, Moses was born. This was the specific time, the time of promise that was being drawn near, that God was going to continue his plan. He was going to fulfill his promise. And 400 years later, the time in which Pharaoh was killing all the babies, right? This was the time providentially decided for Moses to be born. If you're like me, I'm looking at this, even though we know the end of the story, I'm like, why is this the plan? Like, how is this going to work? Right? At this time, Moses was born, and he was beautiful in God's sight, and he was brought up for 3 months in his father's house. Verse 21, and when he was exposed, Pharaoh's daughter adopted him and brought him up as her own son. And Moses was instructed in all the wisdom of the Egyptians, and he was mighty in his words and deeds. So how's this going to work? Here's how it's going to work. God has a plan. God's going to fulfill his promise. It's going to take some time. Doesn't make sense to us, but here's how it's going to work. All this plays out in Exodus chapter 2, 1 and 2, if you want to go back and read your Old Testament and look at it, right? When he was exposed, and it's using that word exposed because this is how they would kill the babies. They would literally leave them out in the open, unprotected. Moses grows up in his father's house, meaning he grew up in a Jewish household under the Jewish customs and rites for 3 months. And then at that time, it was time they couldn't hide him anymore. You know the story, Exodus chapter 2, is they placed him in a basket. They put him on the Nile River, strategically, hopefully close to where Pharaoh's daughter and some other Egyptian women would bathe. And as God sees fit, Pharaoh's daughter, the king's daughter, finds this baby floating in a basket on the Nile River, takes compassion on him, brings him into her house, and begins to raise him as her own, adopts him, right? Probably the only person who could convince the king to do something he didn't want to do was his daughter, right? By God's sovereign plan, Moses finds his way into Pharaoh's house. And not just that, this is like the original kind of Hallmark story, right? But wait, there's more. Pharaoh's daughter, who adopts Moses, finds a nurse to nurse the baby because she didn't have the baby, right? Couldn't nurse at the time. And just so happens Moses' mom is nearby. And so she asks Moses' mom to come in as the nurse to this Hebrew baby, which she didn't realize was her own. God, all the time, right? Fulfilling his promise, step by step, little by little. Moses, then it says, was trained and he was brought up and he was given all of the privileges of the Egyptians, right? Educated, strengthened. It says that he was mighty in his words and his deeds. He was strong. He was educated. They knew him. He looked like them, talked like them, dressed like them, looked the part of the Egyptian leader. And when he was 40, it says, so fast forward 40 years. You know, sometimes this happens in a movie. You see the beginning and it's like 40 years later, right? This is how it happens. When he was 40, so 40 years after that promise, 40 years, it came into his heart to visit his brothers, the children of Israel. I love this verse. 40 years later, if you'll notice the attention to time, this is going to play out in Moses' story. In fact, as Stephen tells it, he gives it in 40-year increments. So when Moses was 40, he says that he wanted to visit his brothers, the children of Israel, not the Egyptians. Right? That's interesting to me. Raised in Pharaoh's home, by Pharaoh's daughter, had everything that the world could offer, the most prolific and advanced society of the time, and he's in the house of the leader, lacking nothing except for his people, his identity, his true purpose. Longing not for Egypt, but for the children of Israel. In verse 24, and seeing one of them, so he goes to visit his brothers, he goes into the Egyptian camp, and seeing one of them being wronged, he defended the oppressed man. And he avenged him by striking down the Egyptian, which, by the way, by all accounts, we understand this to be some sort of righteous avenging. We don't know exactly what was being wronged, but he was defended and killed, and so he murdered the Egyptian on behalf of his brothers, but it was a righteous avenging. And he supposed, verse 25, Moses supposed that his brothers, the Hebrews, would understand that God was giving them salvation by his hand, but they did not understand. Right? Moses shows up and avenges them and gives them salvation, is the word used, an interesting word. Right? Gives them salvation by the hand of Moses, and he's like, they should be grateful, right? I'm bringing salvation to them, but they didn't quite get it. They didn't understand. And the following day, Moses shows up again. The following day, he appeared to them as they were quarreling. These are the two Hebrew guys, now that Moses had saved the day before, are now fighting one another. Moses shows up, and they're quarreling. And so he tries to reconcile them, saying, men, you're brothers. Why do you wrong each other? But the man who was wronging his neighbor, one of the Hebrew guys who was busting up the other Hebrew guy, wronging his neighbor, he thrust Moses aside. He says, who made you a ruler and judge over us? Do you want to kill me as you killed the Egyptian yesterday? Guilty. And at this retort, Moses fled and became an exile in the land of Midian, where he became the father of 2 sons. So Moses flees. This was the time that he was supposed to do everything. This was the time of God's promise coming near, and the time in which Moses was born. And 40 years he had grown, and he was strong, and he was smart, and he was educated and respected, and now he's on the run, and he flees to the land of Midian, which is a desert land. And actually, if you look in verse number 30, which I didn't put in my notes, so it won't be up on the screen, but if you look in verse 30, it says, now when 40 years had passed, right? If we're watching the movie, it would be another subtitle that said 40 years later. Right? So for the first 80 years of Moses' life, waiting on the promises of God. So just 3 quick points of application I just want to draw our attention to. Remember this idea in our journey, in our faith journey, waiting is inevitable. So when we think about Stephen and why he put this here and why it matters to us, I recognize there's kind of 3 balls that we have to juggle. The ball here of the Old Testament of what's going on in Moses' time, and the second ball would be the ball that Stephen is talking to in the first century, the trial that he is on as he gives his defense to Caiaphas, the high priest. And then the third ball would be us in our present day. So we're having to kind of jump 3 different time segments from Old Testament, 1,500 years forward, to first century, 2,000 years forward to present day. Right. 3 quick things. Number 1, patiently wait for God's promise. Right? For 400 years, they had been waiting on God's promise. By the first century, by the time of Stephen's time, not just Moses' time, but by Stephen's time, we're talking multiple millennia later, right? The pain of that wait had just kind of dissipated, almost like vision, right? The time between the promise had grown considerably. So the pain of that promise and the unfulfillment of that promise, or the later fulfillment, the full fulfillment of that promise, the pain of that had dissipated. So back in Moses' time, they were in Egypt under a king who didn't know Joseph. They were being persecuted. They were slaves. They were being oppressed. And at this time, Moses was born. If you're like me, I don't think that that's probably the best time. I'm like, hey, God, why don't you pick a better time? Right? If you're going to raise up a leader from the Jews, why wouldn't you pick a time in which they were a little bit better respected? Like the time of Joseph, who was in charge of things. Why couldn't Joseph have been the one? Right? Why wouldn't that have been better? But if you look back in verse 17, the people had increased and multiplied in Egypt. They had grown. They needed a particular, what we refer to as a critical mass. Somewhere in the 500,000 range, they needed people in order to sustain themselves and to to do the work that had been given. Moses, too, he also had to wait. So the Jews were waiting. Moses had to wait. He had the best training, the best schooling, the best opportunities, but he had to wait until God was ready. 40 years old, right? Waiting takes belief. Right? In order to patiently wait on God, we have to believe God. Right? We have to trust God. This idea of belief is a huge thing. In fact, Jesus, in John chapter 14, he says, believe in God, believe also in me. He says, in my Father's house are many mansions, and I go to prepare a place for you. And if I go to prepare a place for you, I'll come again and receive you unto myself, that where I am, there you may be also. Right? But he starts that promise of eternal life with him in heaven. He starts that promise with believe in God, believe also in me. It's this idea of belief. And if we don't believe, if we don't trust, right, we're not going to wait patiently. Just like our kids, if they're waiting on ice cream that never comes, right, they have a hard time continuing to wait if they don't actually think that it's going to come. Right? If they don't believe that you're actually going to fulfill the promise, they're not going to wait on the promise. So here's the question is, do we really believe the promise of God? Do we really believe that Jesus is the Lord, that Jesus is the Savior, that as we remembered him taking the Lord's Supper earlier today, right? Did we really believe that Jesus' body was broken for us and that his blood was poured out for us, that we might be saved, that he is the Savior? If we do believe, right, then that changes our actions. It changes the way that we live our lives. And we can't just say that we're believers, that we're followers of Jesus and live in the same way. That's not how it works. A few weeks ago, as we were in this series, I gave a big idea that said our actions should always reflect our beliefs. Because here's the thing, is we live today in a world, in a culture where the king of Egypt doesn't know Joseph, if you will. Right? People have forgotten Jesus, this promise of Jesus, this respect, this idea. In fact, there's hostility towards those of faith, towards Christianity. People would say you're just anti this and anti that, and you just want to control what we do or what we can't do or what we want to do with our own bodies or who we can marry or who we can't marry and what we say and blah, 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 blah. Christianity is just anti because our beliefs and our actions don't match. So let me just say, no matter how hard the Egyptians, whatever that looks like in your life, how hard the Egyptians are against you, trust the path. Trust the process. Trust the providence of God. You know, I've learned about waiting is the hardest part about waiting, the hardest part about patience and waiting is that I want to fix things. I want to fulfill things according to my plan, right? According to my timing. If I were them, I would be like 400 years. That's a really long time. How about 100, right? 100 years, that's a really long time. How about 25? Or how about 10? Like, I think we can learn our lesson in 10, right? Or 1. I think I've learned my lesson. I've sat here, right? A little bit. We want it to be fulfilled in our timing and our planning. In our faith journey, as we said, in our faith journey, waiting is inevitable. So patiently wait for God's promise. Number 2, prepare to do what God has called you to do. Prepare to do what God has called you to do. And I would say this pertains both physically and spiritually. Moses was prepared. Some of his preparation was indirect, and some of it was direct. Some of it was just providentially ordained for him. It says that he was brought up in his father's house for 90 days. Now, that may just seem like a random thing for us, but there was a number of Jewish customs that would have partaken, it would have happened in those first 90 days. In addition, he would have also just had 90 days with his mom, who would have become his nurse, right? There was an attachment already there that would have been incredibly natural and continued and easy once Pharaoh's daughter says, I need a wet nurse. I need a nurse to come nurse this baby. Right? Moses would have been circumcised according to the Jewish custom on the 8th day, marked as a member of the covenant people, as a Hebrew, right? An identifier to the Egyptians. When they see this baby abandoned, they know immediately this is a Hebrew baby, right? Because of his covenant circumcision. In fact, because of his covenant circumcision, we can also conclude that Moses' dad, his father, was prepared to prepare Moses, right? His father knew and followed the covenant rituals and rites, and he was prepared to take his son and to circumcise him on the 8th day, and he did. We also see in verse 22 that Moses had the best instruction. It says that he was mighty in his words, which, by the way, is just an interesting thing when it says that he was mighty in his words, because if you remember, and we'll look at the story next week, when God shows up to Moses in a burning bush, and he says, hey, you're going to lead your people. Moses says, whoa, I'm slow in speech, right? He's like, I can't do this. I don't have the words for that. I'm not as eloquent of a speaker. And yet it says that he was mighty in his words, which I think is why it tells us in Exodus chapter 4 that God's anger burned against Moses whenever he began to give excuses. Right? So we must be prepared to do what God has called us to do. It's like a tool in a toolbox ready to be used. A couple months ago, one of my daughters had a problem in one of our vehicles, and I think her door handle had broken, and so she couldn't open the door from the inside. And so I, went to the school of YouTube and figured out how to fix it and ordered the part. And I get the part, and I take the door panel off, and I get to where I'm supposed to be, and I start to take the bolt out that needs to come out, and it's a hex bolt, and it strips, and it just, opens up. And so I have this special tool that's supposed to drill out the middle of the bolt and take it out. And so I get the special tool and I put it on my drill and I get to start to use it, and it just burrows out the middle of this bolt and it won't work. And so I just look at it and I'm like, I'm by no means a mechanic. This is the best I can do. And I'm looking at like, well, the door's just not going to open from the inside, right? That's just the way it's going to be. I can't fix it. Let's buy a new car, right? I don't know. So I called Terry, right? And Terry, if you don't know Terry, he's right here. Terry has a huge shop, and he can fix just about anything. Not putting you on the hook for anybody to call Terry about fixing something, but so I call Terry, and I go over to Terry's shop, and I pull it in, and he looks at it, and we get the door panel off, and we begin to look at it, and he's like, oh, I think I got a tool for that. And he digs around, and he tries the first one, and that didn't work. And then he's like, I think I got a different tool for that. And he digs around a little bit more, and he finally finds the tool, and he puts the thing on, and he puts it on the bolt, and he backs the bolt right out, and we fix the door. Right? Terry was completely prepared. Right? The tool that he used, in fact, I think he had it, and I don't know that he had ever even used that specific tool, but he had it, right? Just in case, so if you have a husband that likes to collect tools, that's why, right? Just in case, he was prepared for the situation, and it fixed the door, right? And I'm thankful for that, right? The interesting thing about being prepared, as we see in Moses' life and the life of many other church leaders from the beginning of Abraham's calling and even before, right? The thing about being prepared is perfection is not required. I tell this to our elders whenever we're interviewing elder candidates and we go through our provisional elder training and all of the things we prepare to bring on new elders. Perfection is not the bar here, because if that were the bar, none of us would be qualified. Right? Moses was a very flawed individual. So was Joseph, so was Abraham, so is Stephen, so are we. Right? There's a long list of God's agents of redemption throughout history, all flawed, but all prepared to do what God has called them to do. So the question is simply, are you prepared? Prepared for what? I'm not sure exactly what God is calling you to do, but I know for sure that God has called us, even as we see in this book, to be a witness, to make disciples. Right? We have to decide in advance to be willing to be prepared and to fulfill our preparation by preparing others. Disciples making disciples. Witnesses witnessing. In our faith journey, waiting is inevitable, so be prepared to do what God has called you to do. Number 3, plant yourself firmly with Jesus. I drew our attention to this verse in verse 23 earlier, and it's just my favorite verse of the whole entire passage. Moses longed for the people of God, right? His community, his identity. He was a follower of Yahweh, a covenant people, follower of Yahweh, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob, the God of Stephen. Right? He was a follower, even though he had the best Egyptian life. He had all that the world had to offer. That wasn't his identity. It wasn't his purpose. Stephen intentionally pointing out to Caiaphas, the high priest, and all those there, that Moses had a decision to make, and his decision was to follow God. Right? To be used by God for God's purposes and not his own agenda. And likely Caiaphas and all of the Sanhedrin standing around Stephen giving this defense would have agreed with his assessment of Moses. And it would have agreed with the summation of Moses. They would have confessed their waiting for the Messiah, but they weren't open to the idea that God's plan was different than their own. That the Messiah might have already come in the person of Jesus. Stephen, however, recalls this story to draw a parallel conclusion about his own life and the life of Jesus, to give it all up for Jesus. In our faith journey, waiting is inevitable, so plant yourself with Jesus. I don't know what promises you're waiting on today. I don't know what you're waiting for God to fulfill, but I know we need to resist the temptation to fall into what we have referred to as transactional faith, where God, if you'll do this, then I'll do this. That's not how God's promises work. That's us wrapping our own timing, our own conditions, our own reality around a promise. Waiting is just hard. It's hard. There are things, church, that I am waiting on, that I have waited on for a long time. And waiting is hard. I know that. It could be time, it could be money, it could be opportunity, job, freedom from a sin, victory over an addiction, healing from an affliction. I can't say when, but I do know that God is faithful. I also know, church, that God is preparing you. He is preparing us to do something. Right? He is preparing. I don't know exactly what he's preparing you to do. I know for sure he's preparing you to make disciples, because that's a clear command we see in the scriptures, to witness. I don't know who's misunderstanding you, like Moses' brothers who misunderstood him. I don't know who around you thinks that they know exactly what you're made for, or what lies they're feeding into you, or what trials you may be walking through. But I do know that God has made you specifically, intentionally, uniquely to be you, and he has placed you like he did Moses in this time and place, intentionally, specifically, that you were born to be right here, right now. And I don't know where you stand with Jesus. I said lastly, just plant yourself with Jesus. I don't know where you stand with Jesus. Maybe it's been a long relationship that's had ups and downs and ebbs and flows. And I get that. Maybe you're just exploring who Jesus is and you've never really trusted him. Or maybe you've trusted in Jesus, but you're confused by what the media says and what you read on social media and just this depiction of who Christians are. And you don't really know which way is up or what's good or who to trust. Let me just simply say, and we'll close, when it all shakes down, you're going to want to be on the side of Jesus. Right? That's just the truth, the simple truth of the matter. You're going to want to be on the side of Jesus. In our faith journey, waiting is inevitable. Let's wait well, church.